Silence is not always golden. At times, it can be a weapon, one that cuts deeper than words. In moments of injustice, pain, and struggle, silence does more than just echo into the void, it devastates lives. Today, I want to challenge you to look at the power of your voice and what happens when it is withheld. When we remain silent in the face of suffering or injustice, we often underestimate the impact of our inaction. It may feel like neutrality or staying out of someone else's business, but the reality is far more profound. Silence in such moments becomes a form of complicity, an unspoken agreement that allows harm to persist unchecked. It becomes a heavy burden for those who are already struggling, and instead of being a source of support, our silence becomes another weight on their shoulders. Think of a person who is enduring relentless bullying at work or school. They may not say anything out loud, but their pain is evident in the way they carry themselves, in their lowered gaze, their withdrawn demeanor, or their hesitant words. If we see this and choose not to act, what message are we sending? Our silence can be interpreted as indifference, or worse, agreement with the behavior they are enduring. It's a quiet nod that tells them their suffering is invisible, their pain doesn't matter, or that they are truly alone. This feeling of abandonment can be devastating, often amplifying the emotional toll they are already experiencing. The harm caused by silence extends beyond interpersonal interactions. When systemic injustice occurs, whether it's discrimination, inequality, or outright abuse, silence from those who could intervene or advocate sends a clear message: the system is fine as it is. People who are marginalized or oppressed often look for allies, for signs of solidarity and support. When they find none, the structures that harm them feel even more immovable, and the fight for change becomes that much harder. Silence in the face of systemic issues isn't just passive, it actively upholds the status quo. Silence also has a way of growing louder over time. For someone enduring hardship, the absence of acknowledgment from others can feel like a deafening void. Imagine someone struggling with their mental health, waiting for someone to notice the cracks forming beneath their carefully constructed facade. Each day that passes without anyone reaching out feels like confirmation that their struggles are insignificant. Over time, this silence compounds, reinforcing their isolation and making it harder for them to reach out for help. The longer the silence persists, the more harm it causes, often driving individuals further into despair. What makes silence so damaging is that it removes the opportunity for connection. When someone is in pain, the simple act of acknowledgement can be life-changing. A kind word, a compassionate gesture, or even a simple question like, "Are you okay?" can remind them that they are seen, heard, and valued. Silence, on the other hand, denies them this connection. It creates a barrier that leaves them isolated in their struggles, feeling like their pain exists in a vacuum that no one is willing to enter. Silence doesn't just affect the individual who is suffering, it also has a ripple effect on the community. When others witness silence in the face of injustice or suffering, it can set a precedent. It sends a message that it's acceptable, or even expected, to stay quiet. This culture of silence perpetuates itself, creating an environment where people feel discouraged or even afraid to speak out. Over time, this collective silence can lead to a breakdown of empathy and accountability, making it harder to address the root causes of suffering. It's important to recognize that silence is often not born of malice but of fear or uncertainty. We fear saying the wrong thing, overstepping boundaries, or getting involved in something we don't fully understand. But these fears, while valid, pale in comparison to the harm that silence can cause. The discomfort of speaking up is a small price to pay for the chance to ease someone's suffering or to stand against injustice. Choosing to speak up, even in small ways, can have a profound impact. It signals to the person who is struggling that they are not alone, that their pain has been noticed, and that someone cares enough to stand with them. It can also inspire others to break their own silence, creating a ripple effect of compassion and action. When silence is broken, it creates space for healing, connection, and change. Ultimately, silence in the face of suffering or injustice is not neutral. It is an active choice with real consequences. It allows harm to continue, deepens the isolation of those who are struggling, and upholds the very systems and behaviors that cause pain. By choosing to break the silence, we take a stand not just for others, but for the kind of world we want to live in. A world where suffering is met with compassion, injustice is met with action, and silence is replaced with voices that bring hope and healing. When we choose not to speak up in the face of injustice, we are not just passive observers, we become enablers of the harm taking place. Inaction is never neutral, no matter how much we convince ourselves otherwise. Silence perpetuates injustice by creating an environment where wrongdoings go unchallenged, leaving the door wide open for those committing harm to continue their actions without accountability. In essence, staying silent sends an unspoken message that what is happening is acceptable or, at the very least, tolerable. For the person experiencing the injustice, this silence can feel like betrayal, further deepening their sense of helplessness and isolation. When someone is mistreated, whether it's discrimination, harassment, or unfair treatment, they often lack the power or resources to fight back alone. They may not feel strong enough to confront their oppressors, and they often look around for support, for allies, for someone to stand with them. But when they are met with silence from those who have the ability to intervene, their oppressors gain more power. The lack of resistance emboldens those who perpetuate injustice, reinforcing their belief that they can act without consequence. Silence gives them permission to continue, and often it escalates their behavior because they feel untouchable. The impact of silence is magnified in systemic injustices, where power imbalances and institutional structures are already heavily stacked against the vulnerable. Whether it's racial inequality, gender-based discrimination, or economic exploitation, these systems thrive in environments where silence is the norm. When people do not challenge the status quo, it remains firmly in place, causing harm to those who are already marginalized. Institutions rely on silence to maintain their grip on power, and when individuals fail to speak out, they unintentionally reinforce these structures, making them even harder to dismantle. For the individual experiencing injustice, the silence of others can feel more hurtful than the initial act of harm. The pain of injustice is often compounded by the realization that those who witness it are unwilling to stand up or even acknowledge it. This silence can leave the victim questioning their worth, their reality, and their place in the world. It isolates them, making them feel as though their pain doesn't matter, and that they are truly alone in their struggle. This isolation can be emotionally and psychologically devastating, often leading to feelings of despair, anger, or resignation. The effects of silence extend beyond the immediate situation. It creates a dangerous precedent, signaling to others that speaking out is not valued or welcomed. In a culture where silence prevails, individuals may become hesitant to raise their voices even when they see or experience injustice. They learn to stay quiet, fearing backlash, judgment, or alienation. Over time, this culture of silence creates a cycle that normalizes harm and discourages intervention. In such an environment, those who perpetuate injustice feel increasingly emboldened, while those who suffer feel increasingly powerless. One of the most insidious aspects of silence is that it cloaks injustice in invisibility. When harm occurs and no one speaks up, it is as though the injustice never happened. There is no record, no acknowledgement, no call for accountability. This invisibility allows the cycle to continue unchecked, often causing harm to multiply and spread. It robs the victim of validation and denies society the opportunity to confront and address the underlying issues. Without voices to highlight what is wrong, there is no pathway to making it right. Many times, people stay silent not out of malice but out of fear or uncertainty. They worry about the personal consequences of speaking out, whether it's losing their job, damaging a relationship, or facing backlash from others. These fears, while understandable, fail to take into account the much greater consequences of staying quiet. When silence becomes a habit, it erodes our shared humanity, allowing harm to persist and grow. Speaking out may come with risks, but those risks are often far outweighed by the damage caused by inaction. Breaking the silence does not always require grand, dramatic actions. It can be as simple as saying, "This isn't right," or standing next to someone who is being mistreated. It can involve reporting harmful behavior, offering support to the person affected, or amplifying their voice when they cannot speak for themselves. Even small acts of courage can make a significant difference, providing validation and solidarity to those who are suffering. These actions can also serve as a powerful deterrent to those who commit harm, showing them that their behavior will not go unnoticed or unchallenged. Choosing to speak out transforms us from passive bystanders to active participants in the fight against injustice. It shifts the balance of power, disrupting the cycles of harm that silence perpetuates. It reminds us of our shared responsibility to one another, our obligation to protect and support those who are vulnerable, and it creates the possibility for change not just in the immediate situation but in the broader systems and cultures that enable injustice to thrive. By refusing to stay silent, we take a stand for what is right. We show the world and ourselves that we will not be complicit in harm, that we value justice over comfort, and that we are willing to act even when it's difficult. Silence may perpetuate injustice, but our voices have the power to end it. When we speak up, we become the catalyst for change, the protectors of those in need, and the architects of a more just and compassionate world. Fear often serves as the primary barrier that keeps us from speaking up in situations where our voice is needed most. It's a powerful instinctive response that can paralyze us, making it difficult to take action even when we know, deep down, that staying silent will cause harm. Fear comes in many forms: fear of confrontation, fear of judgment, fear of making a mistake, or fear of the consequences that might follow if we step forward. While these fears are understandable, they can prevent us from doing what is right, leaving injustice and suffering unchecked. Imagine a situation where someone witnesses discrimination or bullying. They feel a pang of discomfort and know they should say something, but then the questions start creeping in. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I offend someone? What if I become a target too? These internal dialogues are often fueled by fear, and they serve to keep us silent. This hesitation may feel like self-preservation, but in truth, it is a choice that prioritizes our own comfort over the well-being of others. The cost of this choice is high, not just for those directly impacted by the injustice, but for society as a whole. Fear of confrontation is one of the most common barriers. Many people shy away from conflict because it feels uncomfortable or intimidating. They don't want to risk escalating the situation or being drawn into a debate they may not feel equipped to handle. However, avoiding confrontation often means allowing harmful behavior to continue. Confrontation doesn't have to be aggressive or hostile. It can be a calm, assertive acknowledgement that what is happening is not acceptable. Even a simple statement like "that's not okay" can disrupt harmful dynamics and create space for others to do the same. Fear of judgment is another significant factor. People worry about how others will perceive them if they speak out. Will they be seen as too sensitive, too opinionated, or as someone who is causing unnecessary drama? This fear is deeply tied to our desire for social acceptance and belonging, but it often keeps us from standing up for our values. The truth is, the people who matter most will respect you for your courage and integrity. Speaking out may not win everyone's approval, but it will earn the respect of those who value justice and compassion. The fear of making a mistake can also be paralyzing. People often think, what if I say the wrong thing and make things worse? Or what if I don't fully understand the situation? While these concerns are valid, they should not stop us from taking action. It's important to remember that perfection is not required to make a positive impact. A sincere effort to address harm is far better than staying silent out of fear of missteps. If you make a mistake, you can apologize, learn from it, and try again. The willingness to act, even imperfectly, is what matters most. Another common fear is the fear of personal consequences. Speaking out can sometimes come with risks: losing a job, damaging relationships, or facing retaliation. These risks are real and should not be taken lightly, but they must be weighed against the consequences of silence. When we stay silent, we contribute to a culture that allows harm to persist. By speaking up, we have the chance to challenge that culture, to create an environment where people feel safe and supported. Sometimes the risks of action are worth taking because the alternative, allowing harm to continue, is even worse. Fear can also manifest as a fear of stepping out of one's comfort zone. It's easier to stay in the background, to convince ourselves that someone else will take action, or that it's not our place to get involved. This mindset, while tempting, only serves to reinforce the status quo. Every time we choose not to act, we miss an opportunity to make a difference. Breaking out of our comfort zone is not easy, but it is necessary if we want to create a world where injustice and suffering are not tolerated. It's important to acknowledge that fear is a natural response. It's a protective mechanism that has evolved to keep us safe, but it can also hold us back when it becomes overactive or misplaced. The key is not to eliminate fear, but to learn how to move through it. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to act despite it. When we feel fear in the face of injustice or suffering, it's a signal that something important is at stake. It's a call to rise above our hesitation and do what we know is right. Overcoming fear starts with small steps. It might mean speaking up in a low-stakes situation to build confidence or finding ways to support others that feel manageable. It might involve educating ourselves about the issues we care about so we feel more prepared to take action. Over time, these small acts of courage can build into a habit, making it easier to act when the stakes are higher. Fear may be a barrier, but it is not an excuse. Every time we choose to let fear stop us, we allow harm to continue, we miss an opportunity to make a difference, and we deny ourselves the chance to grow. By confronting our fears and choosing to act anyway, we not only help those in need, but also strengthen our own character and values. Fear is powerful, but our capacity for courage and compassion is stronger. It is this strength that can break the silence and create the change the world so desperately needs. Remaining silent in the face of suffering sends a powerful and often unintended message. It signals indifference. When someone is in pain, facing injustice, or struggling with a burden that feels insurmountable, silence from those around them can amplify their sense of isolation and hopelessness. It's not just the act of silence itself, it's the perception that their experience doesn't matter enough for anyone to step forward and acknowledge it. This unspoken indifference can be as painful, if not more so, than the original source of their suffering. It creates an emotional void, a gap where empathy and connection should be. When we see someone suffering and choose to look the other way, our silence becomes complicit. It suggests that we either don't care or that we are unwilling to risk our own comfort to support someone in need. While this may not be our intention, it is often the impact. For the person in pain, silence reinforces the idea that they are alone, that their struggles are invisible, and that they cannot rely on others for help or solidarity. This perception can be devastating, deepening their feelings of despair and alienation. Silence in the face of suffering does more than harm the person enduring it. It erodes the very fabric of community and human connection. At its core, being part of a community means sharing responsibility for one another's well-being. When we fail to act or speak out for those who are hurting, we undermine the trust and solidarity that bind us together. Over time, this culture of indifference can spread, creating a society where individuals are left to fend for themselves and compassion becomes a rarity rather than a norm. It's easy to underestimate the power of even small gestures of acknowledgement. A kind word, a simple question like, "Are you okay?" or an act of support can have a profound impact on someone who feels invisible in their pain. These actions don't necessarily solve the problem, but they let the person know they are seen, valued, and not alone. They create a ripple effect, inspiring others to show empathy and reminding everyone that silence is not the only option. Even when we don't have solutions, our presence and acknowledgement can be a lifeline. Indifference often stems from a belief that suffering is someone else's problem. People convince themselves that they are not responsible for another's pain, that it's not their place to intervene, or that someone else will step in. But suffering is a universal experience, and none of us are immune to it. By choosing to engage with someone else's pain, we reaffirm our shared humanity. We recognize that what affects one person has the potential to affect us all, and that addressing suffering is not just an act of charity, but a collective responsibility. Sometimes indifference is rooted in discomfort. Witnessing someone else's suffering can be unsettling, forcing us to confront our own vulnerabilities and limitations. It's easier to turn away, to avoid the discomfort by pretending not to see. But avoidance only perpetuates harm. It allows suffering to persist unchecked and sends the message that pain is something to be hidden rather than shared. By confronting this discomfort and choosing to engage, we not only help those in need, but also grow as individuals, developing resilience, empathy, and courage. Silence also has a way of normalizing suffering. When pain or injustice goes unacknowledged, it can begin to blend into the background, becoming an accepted part of life. This normalization is dangerous because it desensitizes us to the struggles of others and makes it harder to recognize when something is wrong. Over time, silence can create a culture where suffering is expected and unremarkable, where empathy becomes the exception rather than the rule. Breaking this cycle requires conscious effort, a willingness to challenge the status quo, and to remind ourselves and others that silence is not an acceptable response. The cost of silence extends beyond the present moment. For the person suffering, it leaves scars that may take years to heal. They may carry with them the memory of being abandoned or ignored in their time of need, which can erode their trust in others and make it harder for them to reach out for help in the future. For the person who remains silent, there is often a lingering sense of guilt or regret or recognition, however delayed, that they could have made a difference but chose not to. These costs are avoidable, but only if we choose to act. Indifference is not an inevitability, it is a choice. And like any choice, it can be changed. We have the power to decide how we respond to the suffering of others. We can choose empathy over apathy, action over inaction, and connection over isolation. This doesn't mean we have to solve every problem or take on every burden. It means showing up even in small ways and letting others know they are not alone. It means using our voices, our resources, and our presence to challenge the silence that perpetuates suffering. When we replace silence with compassion, we create a ripple effect that extends far beyond the immediate situation. We build stronger, more connected communities where people feel supported and valued. We set an example for others, showing that indifference is not the only option and that small acts of kindness can have a profound impact. And most importantly, we reaffirm our shared humanity, the understanding that none of us are truly alone and that we all have a role to play in alleviating each other's pain. When someone is suffering, the silence of others can feel like a deafening void. For those in pain, silence can be interpreted as validation of their worst fears, that their struggles are insignificant, that their voice doesn't matter, or that they are truly alone. This perception of abandonment is more than just emotional discomfort. It can have profound psychological and even physical consequences, deepening the wounds that suffering has already inflicted. What makes this silence so damaging is that it often comes from the very people they hoped would support them: friends, family, colleagues, or members of their community. Silence in the face of suffering sends an unintended yet unmistakable message that the person's pain is invisible or unimportant. Imagine a scenario where someone speaks out about a difficult experience, whether it's trauma, discrimination, or a personal hardship, and is met with nothing but indifference or awkward avoidance. In that moment, they are left to wonder if their pain is even real, if it's worth acknowledging, or if they've made a mistake by reaching out. This doubt can lead to a spiral of self-blame and isolation, further magnifying the pain they already feel. The damage caused by silence is compounded when it comes from trusted individuals. People naturally turn to their inner circles, family, close friends, or mentors for comfort and reassurance during tough times. When these trusted figures respond with silence, it can feel like a betrayal. Instead of finding a safe space to share their pain, the person is left to shoulder the burden alone. This betrayal can fracture relationships, creating a distance that may never fully heal. The person suffering may begin to withdraw, no longer feeling that they can rely on anyone for support, which only deepens their isolation. Silence also invalidates the importance of their experience. When someone's pain is met with acknowledgement through words, actions, or even a listening ear, it validates their humanity. It reassures them that what they are going through is seen and that their feelings are legitimate. In contrast, silence diminishes their experience, implying that their suffering isn't worth addressing. This can lead to feelings of worthlessness and frustration, as they struggle to reconcile their internal turmoil with the external apathy they perceive. One of the cruelest effects of silence is that it creates a sense of invisibility. Suffering can already make people feel like they are disconnected from the world around them, as if they are trapped in a bubble of pain that no one else can penetrate. Even when silence is not intended to harm, its impact can be just as damaging. People often remain silent because they don't know what to say, fear saying the wrong thing, or believe that their involvement will only make matters worse. While these hesitations are understandable, they fail to consider the perspective of the person suffering. To them, silence doesn't feel like a thoughtful decision to avoid harm, it feels like rejection. Even a clumsy or imperfect expression of support is often better than no response at all, because it shows that someone cares enough to try. The absence of support leaves a void that suffering fills with self-doubt and despair. When someone is struggling and doesn't receive acknowledgement or validation from others, they may begin to internalize the silence. They may convince themselves that their pain is a burden, that they should suffer quietly, or that they are somehow to blame for their own struggles. This internalization can erode their self-esteem and make it even harder for them to seek help or open up in the future. Over time, this cycle of silence and self-blame can create long-lasting emotional scars. Silence also perpetuates a culture of disengagement. When people see that others remain silent in the face of suffering, they are more likely to do the same. This creates a ripple effect, where silence becomes the norm and speaking out becomes the exception. In this environment, suffering is not just ignored, it is normalized. Those who are struggling learn to keep their pain hidden, believing that no one will respond even if they do speak up. This cultural silence prevents meaningful connections and solutions, allowing pain and injustice to persist unchecked. Breaking this cycle requires a conscious decision to prioritize empathy over discomfort. It means being willing to step into the awkwardness of not knowing the perfect thing to say and choosing to show up anyway. Sometimes just being present is enough. A kind word, a sincere "I'm here for you," or even silent companionship can provide comfort and reassurance. These small acts of acknowledgement can make a world of difference to someone who feels unseen or unheard. Choosing to acknowledge someone's pain doesn't mean you have to fix it. Often, the most valuable thing you can do is simply listen. Giving someone the space to share their story without judgment or interruption can help them feel heard and understood. It validates their experience and reminds them that they are not alone. This kind of support doesn't require expertise or perfection, it just requires a willingness to be there. The silence of others can feel like an abandonment of humanity itself. It denies the fundamental truth that we are all connected, that each of us has the power to make someone else's burden a little lighter simply by showing that we care. Breaking the silence isn't always easy, but it is always worth it. By choosing to acknowledge the suffering of others, we affirm their value, nurture our shared humanity, and create a world where no one has to suffer in silence. When someone is suffering, silence does more than fail to address their pain. It actively deepens their wounds by creating an emotional chasm that amplifies their sense of isolation. Pain, whether emotional, mental, or physical, often thrives in isolation, feeding off the belief that no one sees, hears, or cares. Silence, rather than serving as a neutral response, communicates indifference, whether intentional or not. For the person enduring hardship, this perceived indifference can intensify feelings of abandonment, making their struggles seem even more insurmountable. Suffering is a profoundly lonely experience. It often feels as though the world has moved on while the individual remains trapped in their personal storm. Silence from those around them only reinforces this perception, creating an echo chamber where their pain grows louder and more all-consuming. Without the intervention of understanding words or gestures, the isolation solidifies, convincing them that their pain is theirs to bear alone. This belief not only exacerbates the emotional toll, but also discourages them from seeking help, perpetuating a cycle of silence and suffering. At its core, silence strips away the validation that all humans crave during difficult times. When people are in pain, they long to be seen, to know that their struggles matter to someone. Acknowledgement, no matter how small, acts as a lifeline, affirming that their experience is real and that they are not invisible. Silence denies this validation. It leaves the individual questioning their own worth and the significance of their pain, often driving them into a spiral of self-doubt and despair. The absence of acknowledgement becomes a second wound, one that lingers and compounds the original source of suffering. The power of human connection lies in its ability to provide relief, even when the root cause of suffering cannot be immediately resolved. A simple gesture of support, a kind word, a listening ear, or a warm presence can create a bridge that interrupts the isolation caused by silence. These acts remind the person in pain that they are not alone, offering a semblance of comfort even in the darkest moments. In contrast, silence severs this potential bridge, leaving the person stranded in their struggles without the healing balm of connection. Silence can also have unintended consequences for the one who remains quiet. While it may feel like a passive response, silence often carries a weight of its own, a lingering sense of guilt or regret for not having spoken up. Over time, this unspoken burden can erode relationships, creating an unacknowledged distance between the individual in pain and the one who chose not to act. This gap, born of silence, leaves both parties with unresolved emotions that can fester and grow, making it harder to rebuild trust and understanding. Pain, when unaddressed, has a tendency to magnify itself. It begins to occupy every corner of the person's mind, consuming their thoughts and overshadowing any moments of respite. Silence from others feeds this magnification, as it leaves the individual to face their pain without any external counterbalance. When no one steps in to acknowledge or share the burden, the person in pain is left to shoulder it entirely on their own. This overwhelming weight can lead to mental and emotional exhaustion, making it even harder for them to find a path forward. Even well-intentioned silence can be harmful. Often people remain silent because they feel unsure of what to say or fear saying the wrong thing. They worry that their words might make things worse or that their attempt at comfort will fall short. While these fears are understandable, they overlook the reality of the person who is suffering. For someone in pain, silence often feels worse than imperfect words. It suggests that their pain is too difficult or inconvenient for others to address, reinforcing their sense of isolation. Breaking silence doesn't require grand gestures or perfect solutions. Sometimes the most meaningful response is simply showing up and being present. A heartfelt "I'm here for you" or even silent companionship can speak volumes. These small acts of acknowledgement can provide the person in pain with the reassurance they desperately need that they are not alone and that their struggles matter to someone. In these moments, it's not about having all the answers, it's about making sure the person feels seen and supported. Silence also has a way of normalizing suffering, especially when it comes from a group or community. When people consistently fail to acknowledge someone's pain, it sends an implicit message that suffering is something to be endured in silence. This normalization can lead the person to suppress their struggles further, believing that their pain is not worth addressing or that seeking help would be futile. Over time, this suppression can have serious consequences, from deteriorating mental health to a complete loss of trust in others. The impact of silence extends far beyond the moment it occurs. For the person in pain, the memory of being ignored or overlooked can linger long after the initial hardship has passed. This memory can shape their relationships, their willingness to trust, and their ability to open up in the future. They may carry with them the belief that their pain is not valid or that others will always turn away in times of need. This legacy of silence can create lasting barriers to healing and connection. Choosing to break the silence requires courage and compassion. It involves stepping outside of one's comfort zone and acknowledging another person's pain, even when it feels uncomfortable or uncertain. This act of acknowledgement doesn't just benefit the person in pain, it strengthens the bonds of connection and reinforces the idea that suffering is a shared human experience. It reminds both the giver and the receiver that silence is not the answer, that even the smallest gesture of support can be a light in the darkness.